Plotkin here of Harvard Forest, and she'll be talking about the vegetation response to episodic disturbances.
Good morning. All right. So I'll be speaking about vegetation response to storm damage from hurricanes and winter storms. So going back to 1988, when we began the LTERI program at Harvard Forest, we framed our research in terms of contrasting forest ecosystem effects of natural, generally pulse disturbances versus anthropogenic stresses. Within this framework, we proposed three major experimental manipulations. I'll be talking about the hurricane manipulation experiment that's now finished its 20th year, soil warming, and nitrogen, chronic nitrogen additions to forest ecosystems. And we've done a lot of work contrasting those three, and one of the kind of key early results was that in terms of major carbon and nitrogen cycling, we saw very little or no response in the natural hurricane disturbance relative to the warming and nitrogen addition plots. So focusing a little bit more on the natural disturbance gradient in New England, our original intention in LTERI-1 was to examine a spectrum of experimental gaps, ranging from the hurricane or catastrophic end, which would be a large patch disturbance, to selective overstory mortality, taking out one tree species, to more minor disturbance from our semi-frequent winter storms. We ended up just putting in the full hurricane manipulation experiment, but we've had opportunities in other ways to examine other parts of that disturbance spectrum. Soon after LTERI-1 began, we started focusing our attention on the emerging hemlock-woolly adelgid, and Dave Orwig especially started doing research where that was the worst in southern Connecticut, and obviously we've expanded that until 15 years later, in 2003, we did put in an overstory removal experiment, the hemlock removal experiment that Aaron just spoke about. And then very recently, we've had an opportunity to look at the effects of a more frequent but less severe disturbance in terms of ice storm damage. Bill Munger, Leland Gordon, and Steve Wassler's group had a chance to look at those effects in sort of permanent plots, and so does Allie Dunn, and she's got a poster upstairs. So, let's see. So I'll start by talking about our hurricane research, and just to give a little context, we've studied the ecological importance of hurricanes with a variety of methods, including historical reconstructions, meteorological modeling, and the large experiment, and at several scales, from the stand to landscape to regional scales. And I like this as a nice synthetic figure summarizing our regional scale work that Emery Booz and others completed with modeling and reconstruction techniques to show that the return interval of hurricanes of different magnitudes across the New England landscape. So where you get extensive blowdowns, the more severe hurricanes, those recur about every 150 years in New England. So infrequent, but within the lifespan of trees if you let them get that old. So to focus on the hurricane experiment, this study was implemented in 1990, and we put in one large patch disturbance site in which we pulled over 250 trees mechanically to simulate the physical effects of hurricane disturbance. The indirect effects resulted in 80% canopy damage, which is about what we were aiming for and what we'd expect in this forest type. We paired it with a somewhat smaller control site, so that this is the hurricane plot, this is the control. And we sited it purposefully in our most common forest type in the area at this time, which is red oak, red maple, deciduous forest, getting middle-aged, about 75 years old in 1990. And we were sure to take measurements 1 year prior to the manipulation and then thereafter. So finally, we get some 20-year trajectories of response So I'll just explain for all of these graphs that I'll show, year after manipulation is the x-axis, and then the y-axis shows change relative to baseline or pre-manipulation conditions. The experimental plot is shown in red, the control plot is shown in blue. So, I'll first talk about forest productivity and stand structure. Productivity in terms of litter fall fell to 60% initial values in the experimental site, but that rebounded within 10 years and is now even a little bit higher than the control plot. In contrast, the forest structure was, massively rearranged. We saw a higher drop down to about 40% initial values in terms of basal area, which kind of talks about, kind of the biomass of the trees. And that's recovered more slowly. If this trend line continues, which it may or may not, the hurricane site should recover its pre-disturbance basal area by about year 30. But even so, the control plot is continuing to develop and march forward and accumulate basal area. So the experimental plot will lag behind the control for many decades, unless something else happens. But given that, so let's see. And that just highlights that there are, depending on how you look at results, you get different interpretations of what's happening. And also just to point out that the control itself is dynamic. Over 20 years, it's not a stationary reference. So, to look a little more closely at legacies and new trends in the forest structure and composition, these are maps that we plotted out showing the trees present this past summer at year 20. The dark blue dots, generally bigger, are the overstory trees that were on the site in year 1. So they're either surviving legacies in the pull-down plot or continuing to grow in the control. The orange and turquoise littler dots are trees that are forming the new cohort of trees in the site over the 20 years after the disturbance. So, let's see. Some interesting things. Obviously, there's this burgeoning new cohort of trees. The turquoise dots I've highlighted are the black birch stems, which compose about half of the new stems in the plot. The control plot has very few new trees and is just, kind of steadily gaining importance with red oak is the major player. Let's see, and I'll also just point out that most of these new cohort stems in the experimental plot were present on the site as little saplings or seedlings when the experiment began. And this may not be exactly what we had expected. With a big patch disturbance for foresters out there, it's about 2 acres in size. We expected a larger role, perhaps, of new seedlings of light-rotting species, or perhaps a larger importance of sprouts from damaged trees, because there was this big sprouting response that I'll show a little bit later. Let's see. And the other surprise was just this massive importance of black birch. We knew black birch to be a mound specialist. Here's a beautiful specimen there. But we were a bit surprised at its importance across the site. So, just to show a couple more timelines, highlighting that we have some immediate but non-persistent responses, and then we have some longer lasting responses to the manipulation. Tree sprouting over time, so since this was a hardwood forest, we had a lot of sprouting from damaged trees, and this was elevated in the experimental plot for about the first 10 years. And that was really important. We think that that's a lot of why the site maintains stability and maybe one of the contributing factors to why we saw so little ecosystem response or release of carbon and nitrogen from the site. However, that didn't persist past the last 10 years, and I'll also point out that you see this, something else is going on in the broader context of the area, so that you see dynamics in the control as well. So obviously it's really important to put those together. On the other hand, there was a massive input, of course. What are you debris to the site. And this input of large dead wood is probably one of the most dramatic and persistent effects of the hurricane. All throughout, the hurricane site has an order of magnitude larger volume of dead wood compared to the control. And these volumes are really quite high for any forest type in the region. So now I'm going to move from the hurricane experiment to talk about ice storm damage, which is a more frequent but less intensive storm damage. These slides, Leland Worden, who works with Bill Munger and Steve Watson, provided these slides to me, so that's what I'll be presenting. So many of you, I'm sure, will remember the big ice storm that we had in December 2008. Compared to some areas, Harvard Forest was not as severely affected, but there was widespread patch of disturbance across the Harvard Forest. So the group working on the EMS tower has a suite of 33 permanent plots that are arrayed in the tower footprint that they've been examining since 1993. Yeah. So they were well poised to look at the effects of the ice storm on some parameters in those plots. So they've been measuring seasonal time course of reef area index. And so 2008, the season before the storm, versus 2009, the year after the storm, they saw more than 15% decrease in peak reef area index. So, and that makes a lot of sense because there was a lot of twig and branch damage. We'll be going out again this summer to see how that is changing. And then there was also a big bump in deadwood inputs after the ice storm. Let's see, so both in terms of coarse woody debris, we can look at the top graph, inputs from the ice storm were nearly the same as the last 3 years combined. So in other words, it's about triple your normal input of dead wood after the ice storm. And then also point out this yellow bar is fine woody debris inputs, and then the same coarse woody debris inputs, and this is all in terms of megagrams of carbon per hectare. We don't usually think about fine woody debris inputs as being all that important in the carbon cycle, but you can see, at least in this case, where there was tons of small branch and not giant wood debris inputs, that was really important. So it was definitely worth keeping track of those. So to wrap up with conclusions and future directions, certainly incorporating our knowledge of the effects of both large and smaller storms is really important to incorporate into future scenario modeling. Especially with the hurricane experiment, this may prompt us to revisit our models of forest gap dynamics because we saw such importance of intermediate disturbance or intermediate shade-tolerant species like black birch and not such a big wall of new seedlings and even a big patch disturbance. And finally, I think this would be a really good opportunity in LTERI 5 to focus on how vegetation responses to these episodic disturbances affect forest carbon sequestration. Obviously there's biomass loss, but what the persistence of that would be worth looking at. Focusing in on dead wood inputs and their role along the carbon cycle. And of course, there's changing species composition as in response to these physical disturbances, but then that changing species composition in its own turn drives changes in forest carbon sequestration. And finally, just to point out again that the dynamic control in many of our experiments, and just to point out that it itself is not stationary and will be, should be input into our forest development models generally. So that's all I wanted to say at this time. Okay.
Okay, we got that time for questions for Audrey, and then we'll open up the questions for the other speakers, then we'll talk about some future directions and larger ideas.
Yeah.
I was wondering how common are red maple recruits in the hurricane blowdown or manipulated plots. I'm wondering, he might not remember, but I have a bet going on with Dave Orwig that black or sweet birch might come in first, but I'm betting that red maple will form a second wave of dominance after hemlock lily, Delta, mortality, or perhaps hurricanes. I'm just curious, how common, how abundant are red maple seedlings?
It's second
Yeah.
most abundant in the new recruits.
Yeah.
So that's the one species where you're getting wilted fan tree generation and sprouts from damaged trees contributing to that. So it's
it'll come back in
certainly
30
important.
years.
Yeah.
Thanks.
You framed at the beginning talking about the role of anthropogenic disturbance and natural disturbance and presses and pulses.
Right.
3 examples you gave us were all natural disturbance. Is that because the anthropogenic stuff is so much better understood already, and what we need to understand is the hurricanes and the ice storms and the intermediate?
Not at all. It's just that the focus of my talk was vegetation response to physical natural disturbance. But the soil warming experiment, the chronic nitrogen input experiment, there's a lot more to understand about those. It just wasn't the focus of my talk. There's posters upstairs on those topics, and we've heard about those in the last couple of symposia. So, but they're key.
Thanks.
Yeah.
It might be too early, but have you seen the effects on soil restoration? How many years?
After the ice storm,
Yeah, 5 years.
Bill, have you looked at that? For soil respiration, did you see any change in soil respiration? Okay, yeah, I know that you do sometimes. And then with the hurricane experiment, we actually only measured it the year before and the year after the manipulation, and we didn't see anything happening. That was it. So, there could be things that did happen. Yeah, Eric.
I can try to respond to that question.
Yeah.
In the interannual variation of soil respiration, we haven't been able to relate it specifically to a storm event. There are lots of things that affect interannual variation. But where we have done manipulations, such as through-fall exclusion, and also the girdling and logging at the hemlock site, we certainly see impacts. And we found soil respiration decline significantly, as one would expect, with girdling and logging for several years, and now it's come back up with the regeneration that has occurred.
If I can just follow up with that, part of the LTERI supplement we got a couple of weeks ago, we put together a database of all the soil respiration measurements that have been done at Arbor Forest over the last 18 years or so. There's a poster upstairs by Michael Rabin and some of his students at UMass looking at some of the initial analysis of that. But it's got all the experiments, all the monitoring, auto chambers, manual chambers, whatever, or as it said, 18,000 records and observations of soil. It's an enormous data set. If anyone wants to play with that data set, to extract information out of it for temporal trends or spatial trends, please ask. We're happy to make that data set available. And we really love more people to look at it and think about it.
Any other questions for Audrey?
Yes.
Speculate at all in the hurricane blowdown experiment that control sprouts going almost to the same level as they did after they did the hurricane blowdown, a few years in. Can you speculate at all why that would happen?
I can speculate. I know that there was a winter storm with heavy snowfall in 1993, so there was some minor damage and an increase in sprouting everywhere as a response to that.
I guess, well, if it could be a winter storm, is that, did you also try ice storm conservation?
In those plots,
Yeah, it's,
not specifically, because those plots focus on the larger tree size stems mostly, although there was a closer look at the smaller diameter stems last year, but I don't know if you looked at them in terms of their origin. Yeah, Rose.
How does the above ground biomass compare between the two plots after 20
The
years?
hurricane and control plots?
Yeah.
No, I haven't actually crunched those numbers. I mean, the closest I can tell you is, basal area, which is a real rough partial answer to that. So let's see, they're about, well, that's in terms of relative change. I'd have to look back at the raw numbers, but there's maybe a 25% difference between them.
Thank you, Audrey.
Yeah.
And I'd like to open it now to some, the first few speakers, Sarita, Aaron, Ed, if you didn't get a chance to ask any specific questions on those talks, and we'll move into larger, big picture questions. Any questions for Sarita? Oh, yeah.
Yes, I was wondering if the microbial interactions, if you looked at sort of what happened to the mycorrhizal situation following the destruction of the hemlock forest by the Belgians. In other words, as the black birch moves in, what is black birch, what happens to the mycorrhizal associations that used to be with the hemlock? They moved over to the black birch, or is there a complete shift in the mycorrhizal community?
I think that's probably a question for Dave. I have no idea. I mean, I don't think I want to look at that. But
It's certainly something we should really concentrate on in the future. As diligence here, black birch is going to be marching in here pretty soon, this golden opportunity, and so it's something we should think about pursuing in the future, in addition to a few other things. But anybody else want to take a stab? Or?
Yeah, I think some of that work has been looked at in maybe down in southern New York or Connecticut by Amy Peninga. So we could use that as a model of what we might expect up here.
Jim Lewis has done a little
Yeah,
bit.
Jim Lewis has
She worked with him, so that's the only one we know of that has actually looked at that. Golden opportunity. Aaron.
As a general sort of follow-up observation, I guess I asked Ed about should we be worried about browsing and other experiments. Similarly, how might we leverage or take advantage of these other long-term experiments with the microbial work that so far has been concentrated on around the megaplot and beyond towers? Is there a way that we can sort of ramp up within the context of LTER5, or should we be thinking about it to expand those kinds of studies into these other existing long-term studies that are here? And are there ways that, I don't know if we have archives of soil samples or wood samples or things that we could throw, but even absent that is, are there profitable ways that we should be thinking about moving a microbial activity into the hemlock removal experiment, or in the hurricane pull down, or in these other things that aren't located right behind Shannon Hall?
as you said to someone earlier, we should do it.
Neon is going to provide a very important foundation for that work. If I look at writing grants around it, that foundation is lacking right now, so you have to build that foundation of what's there, what's the structure, level, what's the structure there. And so I think, yes, for up to that time, I think this summer we can get some of that data to start to be able to expand it out of the neon site.
And likewise, we'll have data from the kind of soil warming sites that could also inform an expansion. So absolutely.
Dunsky on that question.
I think Sarita touched on the influence of garlic mustard in terms of, impacts at the soil level. Have those experiments been going on long enough to see any evidence of invasive like garlic mustard playing itself out, even if there's no controlled efforts put onto it, eventually declining, disappearing from the site, which I've heard some talk about. And even if that would happen, what might be the sort of long-term enduring impacts of what's going on in the soil, even if the garlic mustard eventually disappeared? Would you expect those soil effects to endure beyond the presence of the invasive?
I'll let Christina speak mostly to your question, but I guess I would just say that we have a proposal pending to look at that exactly. So the legacy effects of garlic mustard removal on soil processes, including the mycorrhizal effect, but looking more broadly at the microbial removal. But to answer this first part of your question, is Christina sitting right there? I can't see.
Christina?
Christina's the garlic mustard person, so she would have to answer the first part of the question. But certainly we are making an effort to move beyond the current work to focus more on legacy effects after following removal.
And I had a follow-up with that. One of your slides showed reduction in seedling growth associated with garlic mustard and its impact. Has anyone looked at larger saplings or tree growth?
Not that I know of, but
We open up to other questions and ways to synthesize some of these or new approaches to move some of this forward. Yes.
As a consulting forester managing other people's land, I have evolving and emerging questions tying all of what was talked about so far for the rest of the day. I'm very concerned about what HWA is doing and other invasives, both plant and fauna. How to best protect the stream side and the buffer environments on woodlots that I manage that are already losing so much of the hemlock, and considering mycorrhizal activity and general soil productivity and all the invasives that are, the seed banks are there that we don't know yet. And I'm just wondering if here at Harvard Forest, if there's ongoing research particular to widening buffers, aside from wetlands regs and common sense on slope and all that, specific to everything that was talked about so far, and loss of foundation species. It's a big concern because the wildlife have to go somewhere.
I can only comment on a few of those things, and we've dealt with this quite a bit. One thing is, when hemlock is taken out by adulgent or logging, vegetation does come back. The question is, do you want that type of vegetation to be there? Do you want blackbird streamside forests? I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. Common sense tells me always, why muck around on stream sides to begin with cutting? I mean, that's my own personal opinion. It doesn't make sense. Okay, they're pretty vulnerable to other erosion and other things. So I'm all for larger buffers around streams. That's my personal opinion. I don't have scientific data to back that up, but I'm all for what you're saying because vegetation will come back, and if you let them kind of go down slowly, you give other species a chance to get in there more gradually. It's not all at once, and you probably have less disturbance to the stream side environment. So I don't know if other people want to comment on that.
Well, we certainly had the opportunity here at Barker Forest as the Belgian comes in at Prospect Hill to tie together a lot of the work on hydrology and water flow that Emery Booz will be talking about later, that he and Betsy Colburn and Sopsek and Peter Raymond are involved in here at our hemlock removal experiment. We don't have, there are no streams involved in that experiment partly because of the site, partly because we want to do canopy manipulation over a wetland. lots of stream sides and stream buffers has been done at the Colita LTER in Georgia, North Carolina, where they focused explicitly on responses of stream sides to hemlock removal. As Dave says, you know, if you let it proceed slowly so that the vegetation can sort of turn itself over here, and as we saw with the hurricane experiment, you just pull down the trees, the fundamental ecosystem processes don't change a lot because there's rapid regeneration there. But if you put a skidder on it and pull it out and scarify the soil and damage it in that way, then the recovery phase is much longer. And so on the management side, leaving it alone may be better than the preemptive salvage.
I was actually talking more about how I can't control if the HWA is taking away the hemlock. So I'm not talking about necessarily logging. I'm looking to the future of how to, plan for the wildlife habitat issues there.
Get people out in the streams.
It's a harder niche than lots of people.
I think it'd be useful to kind of open up and talk about some of the broader opportunities. I just want to make two comments. I mean, it's very clear that there are ways of bringing together all of those studies that we just heard from. And for example, looking at the deer and moose impacts as the adelgid moves through our forests, looking at how those affect invasive species, and then of course all the microbial aspects, both in the forest and with the interactions among those species. So just to kind of tee that up as a point for discussion. But a broader observation is that this has been a very opportunistic research project or research program. We don't really play by the script. What we do is see opportunities and jump on them and add them to the script. And so quite a few of the things that you've heard about this morning were not originally in an LTR program or weren't started as part of a LTR research effort. Ed pointed out how we seized on the opportunity to look at deer and moose when we started recognizing that it was a critical, that they were becoming a critical part of the forest. The work with HWA was started by Dave Orwick, and that was not part of an original program. In fact, it's been exceedingly difficult to get standard NSF funding for that kind of activity. It was just that we recognize that these are important things that are happening in the landscape and we need to study them. And so we should have that same kind of flexibility. Yes, we set up a research program now for the next 6 years, but we have to build into that the flexibility to seize on opportunities or issues that arise, storms that occur, or to address the kind of management challenges that start emerging because of these issues. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about interactions and bringing some of these studies together. Originally, we thought that deer might be important. We had a lot of studies that were looking at seedlings and saplings, and we knew that if they came in and selectively disturbed those sites, that would very strongly alter our results. We got all set up to integrate the deer into our studies, and then lo and behold, it turned out that the populations were so low that the impacts were small. That's no longer the case. And clearly in something like the HWA situation, we're going to see a lot of problems. Yeah?
David, your experience with the opportunistic nature of this matches our experience with a much younger project with Ultra in the Boston area, which is an urban LTER. And it seems important to me that you have the sort of vision and the long-term plan, but you've got to be open to these things that come up. When the same things happened with us, that we set the course of the study, we wrote the proposal, but that was 3 years ago that we were doing all that stuff. And in the meantime, the playing field evolves rapidly. So I think it seems to be the nature of these things. I don't know whether this is typical of your experience in other LTER sites around the country, but you just have to be optimistic. That's the value of long-term research.
Right, then the question is how do you build in the funding for opportunistic research? That is the challenge.
And you guys have done a great job with that so far.
Seems like as a follow-up to that, I mean, you look at the woolly adelgid because it moved into the area. Looking at Worcester and the Asian long-horned beetle as another vector. So it seems like writing in the study topic and then writing it so you have that chance to be flexible with whatever drivers happen. You have the climatic changes. We haven't really talked about the socioeconomic changes in land use. I know that will happen after lunch, but the current economic downturn, I think, has effects on land development and pressure, which again could look at your larger scale issues as you look at land use change,
Right.
how that rate changes over time.
Right.
I think you're not going to go tease that together a bit as well.
Yeah, in fact, the HWA study, in the original 88 proposal, we had actually, John Eber was very interested in this, the issue that Aaron's talking about, which is the selective removal of particular species. And the impact, in his particular case, it was mostly the chemical impact, biogeochemical impact of selective removal. And so we had devised an experiment where in one large, relatively homogeneous forest, we were going to have plots where we removed oak and other places where we removed maple, recognizing that they had different chemical signatures and influence on the overall environment. We ended up scrapping that project and instead substituting in the HWA because that was a real live example of something that was going to be happening in our landscape. And we actually started that project very shortly after the adelgid really became prominent in southern New England because we assumed that it would become important. So you're right, it's sitting back and kind of always scanning out and seeing what the issues are. All right.
One thing we might think about that's